A battle Psyker, cursed by visions of slaughter, is forced into a war he cannot survive, hunted by enemies and feared by allies, as his powers spiral beyond control. The first time Arik Valen felt the screaming in his bones, he thought it was just another nightmare. Battle Psykers lived inside nightmares. It was the only place the Imperium allowed them to breathe. But when the screaming followed him into waking life, curling beneath his ribs, rattling behind his eyes, shaking the air around him, even though no one else reacted, he understood it was something far worse than fear. It was a warning, and warnings for Psykers were curses. It began in the mud-thick dusk of Velis Prime, a world already broken by a war it never asked to fight. Arik stood among a column of retreating guardsmen, the regiment's boots dragging through ash that clung to skin like regret. His name had been spoken only minutes earlier by the commissar, shouted above the artillery fire that shook the trenchworks. Psyker Arik Valen, front line now. You're needed, as if any of them wanted him near, as if any man willingly walked beside a weapon that could explode simply because it remembered too much. But Arik went, because Psykers who hesitated died with a bolt round in the back of the skull, and because the Emperor required obedience even when the soul buckled. He had barely reached the firing step when the knock came, not on a door, not on any physical surface, but on the inside of his mind. A faint tap, like bone grazing bone, followed by a slow scrape. The sound froze him in place. No wind touched the trenches. No voices whispered. Yet something was knocking, trying to enter, trying to speak. His breath stuttered, and the guardsmen around him noticed. Not the sound, never the sound, but the tension flooding his shoulders, the pallor draining his face. "Valen," Sergeant Ren Icaro barked, a coarse-voiced man whose patience had been stripped away by too many battles and too little mercy. "You collapsing on us?" "No," Arik forced out, though his voice trembled with the effort of containing something that wanted to tear out of him. "Just pressure. The warp is moving." That was all Ren needed to hear. His jaw tightened, his stance widened, and his eyes, usually steady, flicked toward the bolt pistol holstered at his hip, not as a threat, as a contingency. Arik swallowed the bitter taste of it. Psykers didn't get comrades, they got minders. Before Arik could speak again, the screaming returned, bursting past the knock, flooding through him like molten metal. He staggered forward, clutching the trench wall as the world twisted. He saw the battlefield in front of him, yes, but layered over it, bleeding into it, devouring it, was another battlefield, one that hadn't happened yet. Bodies burned in the dirt, helmets split apart, blood pooled in shapes he recognized but wished he didn't. The regiment was dying. No, not dying. Already dead, and he was standing among their future corpses. Someone grabbed his shoulder, Ren trying to steady him. "Arik, focus. Emperor's sake, focus." Arik tried. He truly did, but the vision sharpened instead of fading. He saw himself kneeling in the center of the carnage, light pouring from his eyes, his hands, his mouth. He was screaming too, though no sound left him. He saw a commissar behind him lifting a pistol. He saw the trigger begin to tighten. The vision shattered when reality struck back. An artillery shell hit close enough that the trench buckled, throwing bodies across the mud. Arik hit the ground hard, breath torn from him. Some guardsmen scrambled to their rifles, others prayed, but Arik remained frozen, heart pounding in sync with the fading echoes of the future he'd just witnessed. He pushed himself up with shaking hands. Ren's face swam into view, smeared with dirt and fear. "What did you see?" Arik hesitated. The truth was a weight he could barely carry. The commissar would execute him for revealing such uncontrolled foresight, but if he said nothing, the regiment would walk blind into annihilation. "I saw us die," Arik whispered. "All of us." Ren didn't flinch. Grief flickered across his face, but grief was a luxury he pushed aside instantly. "Details." His tone was almost gentle, the kind of softness only men who expected death allowed themselves. Before Arik could answer, another wave of psychic pressure slammed into him. This time it didn't knock, it tore. The warp clawed at the edges of his mind. Desperate, hungry, impatient, he doubled over with a strangled gasp. A shadow fell across him, a commissar's coat. Commissar Lysa Thorne, crisp uniform, cold grey eyes, a presence that demanded obedience simply by existing. She looked down at Arik as if measuring whether he would be more useful, alive or dead. "Psyker Valen," she said. "Stand." He tried. His legs didn't respond. She placed a hand on the grip of her bolt pistol. "Stand, or I will ensure your suffering serves the Emperor in a more immediate fashion." He forced himself upright. Sweat dripped down his spine. The warp pounded in his skull as if trying to burst free. "What did you see?" she asked. He opened his mouth, and then everything around them went silent. Not quiet, silent. The trench shook with the absence of sound, a void so complete that even breathing felt too loud. Every guardsman froze. Even the guns in the distance seemed to hold their fire. The warp pressed against Arik's skull with a pressure that made his vision blur. Ren looked around violently, eyes wide. Commissar Thorne reached for her pistol again. again. The silence broke with a child's voice. Not a real child, a voice inside Oric's mind. Soft, trembling, terrified. "Help!" Oric's throat closed. He recognized that voice. He had heard it only once before, years ago, on the day the black ships took him from his family. Girl, his younger sister, Lyra, calling after him as the enforcers dragged him away. They had been separated. Different ships, different fates. Lyra was dead. She had died during screening. The letter had been brief. So hearing her voice now, inside his mind, fractured something deep within him. Ren shook him. "Arik, say something." But Arik didn't have time to answer, because the ground beneath the trench began to ripple, not from artillery, not from bombardment, but from something crawling through the layers of reality itself. The warp bled through the soil, the walls, the air, each pulse echoing with his sister's voice. Commissar Thorne aimed her pistol at Arik's skull, her voice low, controlled. "Psyker, what have you done?" Nothing, it isn't me." The earth split open behind them with a shriek of tearing metal. Not a natural sound, not a mortal sound. A rent in the warp, small but growing, glowed like an open wound, spilling light that twisted into impossible colors. The guardsmen scrambled back, some screaming, some praying. Arik felt the pull immediately, like chains hooking beneath his ribs. Something inside the breach was calling to him, calling him by name. A shape began to form inside it, a silhouette, small, thin, child-sized. Ren grabbed Arik by the scruff of his collar. "Tell me that's not your sister?" "I don't know," Arik whispered. And the truth, the real truth, was worse. A part of him hoped it was. The breach pulsed again, and the silhouette stepped forward. The silhouette emerging from the warp light moved with a fragility that made every soldier within sight recoil. Not because it looked monstrous, but because it looked almost human. That near-humanness was worse than any demon's snarl. An echo of familiarity wrapped in corruption. Arik's breathing hitched. The figure's outline flickered between solid and luminous, its edges dissolving like smoke in stuttering pulses. But the height, the thin shoulders, the way the hands curled inward, trembling, all of it aligned with a memory burned into Arik's soul. A child clutching his sleeve as the black ship's officers pulled him away. Rennick Harrow muttered a prayer beneath his breath, voice shaking. Commissar Thorne, in contrast, became unnervingly still, her pistol rising with mechanical calm. She didn't blink, didn't breathe. Her expression was a stone mask, carved to kill. The silhouette took another step, and with that motion the warp tear brightened, filling the trench with a sickly radiance that sent waves of nausea rolling through the guardsmen. Some collapsed to their knees, clutching their helmets. Others retreated until their backs slammed into the mud-packed wall. A few held their rifles up in desperate terror, though none dared fire, not with the commissar watching, and not with the Psyker at the center of whatever nightmare had begun. Arik stumbled forward without meaning to, drawn like a moth to an open flame. He felt his skull vibrate with a pressure so intense he almost expected it to crack open. The voice in his mind trembled again. "Arik, help me! It hurts!" His gut twisted. Panic surged through his chest so violently it almost sent him doubling over. The words were Lyra's. Every pitch, every stutter, every childhood tremble. But the cadence was wrong. Too slow, too deliberate. Something was using her voice like a puppet might use a face. Ren grabbed Arik's arm. "Don't move. Emperor's blood, you hear me? Don't move toward that thing." "I need to," Arik began, but a sharp pain lanced through his skull, cutting off the words. Blood trickled from his nose. His vision split, showing him two worlds at once. The trench and the future carnage overlaying it like a second skin. Every guardsman he saw stood twice, once alive, once dead. Commissar Thorne's corpse version lay with her throat torn open. Ren's lay with his chest crushed. And Arik didn't lie anywhere. He wasn't among the bodies. He was the cause of them. The vision warped, flickered, and vanished when the figure in the warp finally solidified, fully stepping into reality. It was a girl, or the ghost of one. Her skin glowed faintly, veins shimmering beneath as though filled with liquid starlight. Her eyes were milky white, fixed forward with a hollow emptiness that made Arik's heart claw against his ribs. She wore a simple shift, torn and burned at the edges. Her hair floated around her head as if suspended in water, and though she hovered inches above the ground, her footsteps still echoed inside Arik's mind, with the weight of a life he had failed to protect. "Lyra?" he whispered. The name left him like a confession. Her head tilted with a slow, unnatural precision, and her lips parted. But the voice that came out was not hers. "You left me." The sound was layered, Lyra's voice woven with something ancient and predatory beneath. The guardsmen around him flinched as if struck. Commissar Thorne tightened her grip on her pistol, jaw clenched. "I didn't," Arik's voice cracked. "I didn't leave. They took us." "You didn't look back." Arik's vision blurred. He remembered the day, the sobs, the fear, the steel hands of enforcers dragging him into the shuttles of the black ships. He remembered crying out for Lyra until his throat bled. The metal doors had shut before he saw her face again. But this thing wearing her voice didn't care about the truth. The warp never did. It fed on guilt, twisting it until it became a knife. The girl drifted closer. The air around her shimmered with heat, cold, static, every sensation at once. Ren tried to pull Arik back, but Arik's legs refused to obey. He stood rooted in place, mind unraveling, beneath the tension of recognizing something he knew he could not accept as real. Commissar Thorne stepped between them, raising her pistol. "Identify yourself," she commanded. Voice steady. The girl blinked, slowly, too slowly. Then she spoke again. "I am the door he opened." The warp-torn ground heaved. Mud split into jagged fissures. Arik felt a force surge out of him, through him, like a dam bursting. His knees buckled, and he collapsed, hands sinking into the trembling earth. He gasped for breath, only half aware of the screams beginning around him. Ren cursed, pulling back, as the soil beneath his boots writhed like something alive. Commissar Thorne fired. The bolt round detonated against the girl's chest, blossoming into a plume of gore and light. But she did not fall. The wound evaporated, knitting together like threads reweaving themselves. She smiled, and the warp screamed through the trench like a hurricane. Guardsmen flew in every direction, smashed against walls, hurled into the air, dragged across the ground as if invisible hooks had sunk into their flesh. Thorne's coat whipped around her, her feet sliding back a full meter before she dug her heels in and fired again and again, her pistol barking thunder. Every bolt vanished within inches of its target. Warp light swallowed the shots whole. Arik struggled to push himself up, but psychic force pressed down on him like a titan's hand. He felt the air vibrating with energy that shouldn't exist outside the Imperium. His vision flickered with images, flashes of the past, the future, things that had never happened and things that might. He saw Ren on his hands and knees, blood on his temple. He saw Thorne standing alone against a storm she couldn't possibly survive. He saw Lyra, his real Lyra, smiling at him from a memory untouched by corruption, her small hand tugging his sleeve. Then the false Lyra spoke again, and her words tore the world apart. "Arik Valen belongs to us." Arik screamed, not with fear, but with denial so fierce it cracked through the warp pressure, crushing him. A psychic shockwave blasted out from his chest, shattering the ground around him. Thorne was thrown back. Ren crashed against the trench wall. The warp girl flickered, her form warping as though someone had shaken a reflection on water. Arik staggered to his feet. For the first time in his life, he didn't run from the power inside him. He reached for it. The warp surged into him like a flood, heat and agony and ecstasy in one pulse. He felt every mind within a kilometer radius, every fear, every heartbeat, every prayer. He pushed forward, screaming her name. "Lyra!" The warp girl jerked as if struck. Her shape rippled, glitching between forms. Child, silhouette, corpse, flickering light. The distortion intensified, her face contorting with something like pain. Then a whisper slipped through the storm, so faint only Arik heard it. "Help me. Arik, it's dark." Arik froze, his breath shattered in his throat. That voice, that one, was hers. Ren coughed violently, dragging himself upright. "Arik, what are you doing?" Arik didn't answer. He couldn't, because something clawed at the edges of his mind, something trapped behind the warp girl's mask, a presence, weak, fading, but real, his sister, alive, somewhere. Commissar Thorne rose to her feet, blood streaking her forehead. "Psyker Valen," she said, voice low and lethal. "Step away from that creature, or I will execute you where you stand." Arik didn't move. The warp girl screamed, not in rage, in terror, a sound that sliced reality like a blade. She lunged toward Arik, her hands outstretched, fingers elongating into shards of light. Ren shouted. Thorne fired. Arik reached out. Warp and reality collided. The trench exploded in blinding light. When the brightness faded, Arik wasn't standing in the trench anymore. He was somewhere else, somewhere impossibly dark, somewhere impossibly alive. A space made of whispers and memory and pain. A place between the world and the warp. In the distance, he heard a child crying. Not a monster, not a demon. A child, his sister, calling for him. "Arik, please, don't leave me again." Arik's heart broke open. He took a step toward the sound, and the darkness moved with him. Darkness closed around Arik like a living shroud, thick with the weight of whispered memories. It wasn't night, nor shadow, nor absence. It was presence, a vast, breathing darkness that flexed and contracted as if the entire realm were the inside of some titanic creature's lung. A cold pulse rippled through it with each soundless heartbeat, and as Arik stepped forward, the ground beneath him shifted with the consistency of dust fist made from ground-up bones. He moved blindly through the void, arms half raised, breathing ragged as the psychic aftershock crackled beneath his skin. His mind still rang with the fury of the warp tear, the warp girl's scream, the reality-shattering blast that had swallowed the trench. He didn't know if Wren was alive, if Commissar Thorne survived, if any guardsmen remained standing. He didn't know if he had killed them all, only that the silence behind him was absolute. But ahead, somewhere up ahead, his sister's voice echoed, "Arik, don't leave, please." Each plea trembled with a raw fear that tore at him more savagely than any demon's claws. Even warped, distant, and muffled by the psychic static of the place, it still sounded like her, like the girl he had once sworn to protect, the girl he'd been torn away from, the girl he'd failed. He pushed forward again, boots grinding on the brittle ash beneath him. Around him the darkness quivered, then spiraled into faint shapes, fractures of memory rising like smoke from smoldering ruins. A hallway, a door, a child's hand slipping from his, a shuttle hatch closing with the finality of a coffin lid. Every step he took made another shard of vision form, hover, then fade. None stayed long enough to hold on to, but each gouged deeper into his thoughts. "Lyra!" he shouted, his voice sounding strangely muffled, as if swallowed by cotton. "Lyra, I'm here. Just keep talking. I'm coming." His words rippled outward in a slow, almost syrupy wave. The darkness trembled in response, but did not answer with her voice. It answered instead with its own, a chorus of whispers, overlapping, contradictory, each one layered like threads of rotting cloth, pressed into Arik's ears, skittering across his nerves. "Not her. Not her. She is lost. She is ours. You brought us here. You opened the door. Little Psyker, little vessel." Arik stopped, his breath hitched. The shadows around him stretched and twisted, becoming tall, thin silhouettes with no features, only faint glimmers where eyes might have been. They swayed without wind, hungering toward him. The whispers grew louder, more distinct. "You came alone. You die alone." Arik squeezed his eyes shut and forced the psychic barrier upward, a bubble of shimmering light around him. The silhouettes recoiled, melting back into the void. But even as they fled, their voices remained. "You can't save her. You couldn't save her then. You won't save her now." He gritted his teeth. The power inside him surged like wildfire, begging to be unleashed. It frightened him, but the fear was a distant second to the rage that now churned through him. They wanted to break him, to make him doubt, to drag him down before he could reach the truth. He refused. He walked. The darkness shifted again, increasingly turbulent, as though resisting his movement. Ahead, a faint glow finally appeared, soft and flickering, the color of candlelight seen through fog. He quickened his pace until the void thinned, and the ground solidified beneath him into something firmer, smoother. The ash gave way to stone. The air grew colder, sharper, and suddenly the darkness snapped away. He stood in a corridor, narrow, metallic, familiar, the black ship. His childhood nightmare solidified around him with sickening clarity. Corridors lined with reinforced doors, etched with sigils of warding, the metal floors humming with the psychic dampening fields that had made every breath feel like drowning back then. The air tasted sterile, suffocating. Overhead, lights flickered weakly, casting long, trembling shadows. Arik staggered back, heart hammering. He reached out and brushed his fingers along the wall. Cold, real, too real. "Lyra," he called again, but his voice wavered. The ship seemed empty, abandoned, no footsteps, no murmurs, no echo of other minds, just him and the ship, rebuilt from memory or nightmare, or both. He walked forward slowly, every step leaving a faint echo. His breath fogged the air, though he didn't feel cold. His pulse pounded in his ears with an animal urgency, telling him this place was wrong in ways he couldn't name. A door slid open on his left. He turned sharply. Inside the room hung dozens of thin silver restraints, floating, rotating gently. No bodies, no chains, just bonds, waiting for wrists that had been taken long ago. A child's laughter drifted behind him. Light, innocent, wrong. He spun around. The corridor behind him was empty. More laughter, closer, echoing through the metal halls. Then, "Arik?" His lungs froze. The voice was perfect, soft, small, trembling with fear. He ran. The corridor stretched ahead endlessly, bending slightly to the left, then the right, as if the ship itself were changing to keep him moving. Doors slid open as he passed, showing glimpses of rooms filled with blurred shapes, memories half-formed and dissolving the moment he tried to focus. "Arik, help me!" He sprinted harder. At the far end of the corridor, a figure stood, a girl, barefoot, hair tangled, dress torn. "Lyra." He slowed, chest heaving, eyes stinging. She looked exactly as she had when he last saw her, 8 years old, eyes wide with terror, reaching for him as enforcers dragged him toward the shuttle. Lyra, he whispered, barely able to breathe the word. She stepped forward, cautiously, eyes glistening, a trembling smile forming. But something was wrong, not in her shape, not in her voice. In her shadow, it didn't match her movements. It lagged behind, then surged forward too quickly. It flickered, stretched, then paused completely while she kept walking. His gut tightened. Lyra? She blinked, then her head snapped to one side with a sharp, jerking motion that made her neck crack unnaturally. When she looked back at him, her eyes had changed. White, blank, warp-lit. The child's form melted like wax in fire, stretching, expanding, twisting upward into a taller shape. The warp girl's silhouette reforming before his eyes, her mouth split into a smile filled with static and light. Arik recoiled just as the corridor around him thrashed, metal bending inward like a crushing fist. "No!" he roared, thrusting both hands outward as psychic power erupted from his chest. The corridor shattered, reality tore open like wet paper. The warp girl lunged. Arik was ripped off his feet as the world erupted in blinding white. He crashed onto cold stone. A new place, a new space, a massive chamber of floating shards, fragments of memory, pieces of worlds, splinters of time, all orbiting a central pillar of light. At the base of that pillar, curled into a shivering ball, was a child, a real child, not warped, not shifting, not false. Her hair was tangled around her shoulders. She hugged her knees to her chest. She stared blankly into nothing. Arik's breath stopped. Lyra! She didn't look up, didn't move, didn't blink, but she was breathing, alive. Before he could move toward her, the screaming began, high-pitched, layered, endless. The warp girl materialized behind the child, her form stabilizing into something sharper, more human, yet wrong in every way. She reached for Lyra with elongated fingers glowing like molten glass. Arik stopped thinking. He attacked. The chamber detonated into psychic war. Light tore across the void, shadows exploded upward, and the central pillar crackled as the warp itself bent under the weight of their clash. Arik slammed into the warp girl, power pouring through his arms. She shrieked, her face fracturing into multiple overlapping images. Around them, memory shards burst like fragile glass. Lyra didn't move, didn't react, didn't even seem aware the battle raged around her. The warp girl's voice clawed into Arik's mind. "She is ours. She always was. You brought her here the moment you broke. You opened the way. You called us." Arik roared back, pushing harder, forcing every last drop of strength into the attack. "You don't get to have her." The warp girl convulsed, limbs snapping at strange angles as her form began to tear apart. Ribbons of light unraveling from her like peeling skin. Reality rippled, the ground split, the chamber collapsed into a cyclone of screaming fragments. Arik dove for his sister, his hand closed around hers, warm, small, real. The warp howled, and everything went black. Arik surfaced into consciousness like a drowning man clawing his way through ice. There was no light at first, only weight, crushing, suffocating weight, the kind that made his lungs convulse in desperate, panicked spasms. Then slowly, as if some colossal hand uncurled its fingers from around his skull, the pressure eased enough for him to suck in a ragged breath. The air burned like cold metal. His pulse pounded hard enough to rattle his teeth. He opened his eyes. The world was wrong again. He lay on his back in a wide expanse of grey stone that cracked outward in long, jagged fractures, glowing faintly at the edges like cooling magma. The air hummed with lingering warp static, shimmering in slow ripples that distorted the space above him. A chill crawled through the back of his skull, the kind that meant the barrier between real space and whatever he had just wrenched himself from hadn't fully healed. The ground trembled beneath him with a dull, rhythmic cadence, like distant artillery, but too steady, too patterned. He tried to sit up. Pain lanced through his ribs and spine. His muscles spasmed violently, refusing to cooperate. He clenched his teeth and forced himself upright anyway, ignoring the black motes that crawled across his vision. Then he remembered. Lyra. His heart lurched. He whipped his head around so sharply that his neck cracked, and there she was, lying a few feet away, small and motionless, on the fractured stone. Her tangled hair stuck to her face with sweat. Her chest rose and fell in shallow, irregular breaths. Her arms were curled tight to her body, fingers clenched as though gripping something in a nightmare she couldn't wake from. Arik crawled to her on shaking hands and knees. The movement made his head spin, but he didn't care. He reached out and touched her cheek, terrified that his fingers would pass through her like they had in so many warp-forged illusions. But they didn't. Warm, real, alive. He released a shuddering breath and rested his forehead against her shoulder for a long moment. A tremor ran through her muscles, and she whimpered softly, not awake, not aware of him, trapped somewhere behind the bruised dark exhaustion pressing down on her mind. Then something shifted in the air. A heavy metallic groan echoed from above, followed by a cascade of dust sifting down from the unseen ceiling. Arik lifted his head and realized they were inside some kind of chamber, vast, circular, possibly underground but lit by no visible source. The walls were carved with deep, ancient sigils, each one pulsing faintly, as though alive. He didn't recognize their style, not imperial, not chaos, not anything he had studied. The ground beneath them vibrated again, and then he heard footsteps, dozens, marching in tight formation. The sound grew louder, sharper, accompanied by the faint static hiss of vox units and the low thrum of power packs being charged. Arik's blood went cold. He rose to a crouch, placing himself between the sound and Lyra, even though he could barely stand. His instincts screamed at him to run, but there was nowhere to go. The chamber had no visible entrances, no doors, no cracks except the ones glowing underfoot. Then a section of the far wall folded open like a blooming metal flower. A flood of cold white light poured in. Arik shielded his eyes, and the silhouettes stepped through. Imperial figures, but not guardsmen. Interrogator robes, acolytes with auspex gear, servo skulls drifting like hungry insects. Behind them strode the unmistakable shape of power-armored giants, their pauldrons painted in black and bone. Deathwatch, killing machines forged for the singular purpose of ending nightmares. And at their head walked a man Arik knew instantly, even though he had never met him. Inquisitor Valen Dravik, tall, severe, eyes like blades honed on decades of suspicion. His carapace armor was etched with wards that glimmered faintly as the warp static washed over him. His expression, illuminated by the harsh light from behind, was unreadable, but not surprised, not horrified by the fractured, half-warp, half-real carnage around them. He had expected this. Arik's hands curled into fists as Dravik approached with measured surgical steps, every motion radiating authority sharpened by cold, doctrinal ruthlessness. Psyker Arik Solna, the Inquisitor's voice carried effortlessly through the chamber, crisp and surgical. You have walked where you were not meant to walk. Arik swallowed hard. She's just a child, he said, his voice hoarse. The words scraped like broken glass on the way out. Dravik's eyes flicked lazily to Lyra's unconscious form. A child carrying a signature of warp resonance so severe it registered on astropathic arrays half a sector away. His gaze returned to Arik. You brought her here, and you tore a hole in reality large enough that even the trained Psykers on my ship screamed in their sleep. Arik's pulse thundered. I didn't bring her here. They dragged her into that place. I pulled her out. You opened the way, Dravik corrected. Intention is irrelevant when the breach is already carved. Behind him, an acolyte raised a scanning device. It emitted a shrill whine as it passed over Lyra's small body. Symbols flashed red, very red. The Deathwatch Marines tightened their formation. Arik stepped forward instinctively. 3 bolters snapped up in perfect unison. He froze. Dravik's expression didn't change. Psyker, you will remain precisely where you are. She's harmless, Arik whispered, even though a part of him knew the words were fragile lies. The warp didn't chase harmless children. It chased beacons. And Lyra burned bright enough to scar the void. Dravik motioned for the acolyte, who approached Lyra cautiously, an injector ready in his hand. Arik felt his heart spike with raw panic. Don't touch her. The world jerked. Not physically, psychically. A pulse detonated outward from Lyra's unconscious body, silent, invisible, but heavy enough that the acolyte's knees buckled and he collapsed with a choked cry. The injector clattered from his hand and skittered across the stone. The Deathwatch staggered a half-step, armor clanging. Servo skulls spiraled uncontrollably before stabilizing. Every eye snapped toward Lyra. Her body had not moved. Her breathing had not changed. But something behind her closed eyelids had shifted. Something vast. Something terrible. Arik's breath caught in his throat. Dravik watched the child with new intensity, calculating, analyzing, dissecting. Then he looked at Arik again, and there was no anger, no fury, only the precise, dispassionate resolve of someone who dealt not with people, but with equations. You understand what she is, don't you? The Inquisitor asked softly, almost gently. What the warp has made her into? She's my sister, Arik said, trembling. That's what she is. Dravik nodded slowly. And that is why you are dangerous. He lifted a hand. The nearest Deathwatch Marine moved forward. Arik moved too. He didn't think, didn't plan. Fear and instinct fused into a singular, reckless impulse. Protect her, always protect her. His psychic power flared, wild and desperate, barely under his control, as he threw himself between Lyra and the advancing giant. The Marine raised his gauntleted hand, A blade of force exploded from Arik's palm, reflexive, uncontrolled. The Deathwatch Marine halted mid-step, not by choice. He was held in place, suspended, immobile, as the psychic blade hovered inches from the throat of his armor. The air warped around Arik, bending as if gravity had forgotten its own rules. Every breath felt like swallowing electricity. He didn't know how long he could hold the power in check. His vision vibrated with static. "Arik Solner!" Dravik said sharply. "Stand down." Arik didn't move. Couldn't. "Stand down." The Inquisitor strode forward, despite the Psyker's uncontrolled aura tearing at the edges of reality. He stopped a few paces away, unflinching even as the stone at his feet cracked from the pressure. "Psyker," he said calmly, "if you lose control, you won't just kill my men, you'll kill her." The words hit Arik harder than bolter fire. His knees gave out, the psychic blade flickered, then shattered into harmless sparks. The Deathwatch Marine staggered back, coughing. Arik collapsed to the stone, chest heaving, tears burning tracks down his face. He didn't remember crying. Didn't remember feeling anything except terror. He reached for Lyra's hand. Dravik grabbed his wrist before he could touch her. Arik looked up, breath caught in his throat. Dravik's expression had changed, not softened, but shifted, from suspicion to reluctant realization. "This child," the Inquisitor said quietly, "has already crossed the threshold between humanity and the impossible." He looked down at Lyra with something like grim awe. "But she has not fallen, she has not turned, and despite being dragged into the warp, she held onto herself." Arik froze. The world hung still. "So we will try something," Dravik continued. "Something unprecedented." He released Arik's wrist and stood. "Arik Solner, by my authority, you are placed under provisional inquisitorial guardianship, not as a prisoner, but as an anchor." Arik blinked. What does that mean?" "It means," Dravik said, "that your sister is not stable. She will never be stable. But she responds to you. Your presence tempers the resonance, so you will remain with her." Arik felt his pulse race. Relief, terror, gratitude, all of them at once. "And if I refuse?" he whispered. Dravik looked at him with flat, unblinking honesty. "Then she dies." Arik felt the floor tilt beneath him. He looked down at Lyra, small, fragile, her face pinched with pain even in sleep. She had no one else. She had never had anyone else. He nodded. Dravik exhaled slowly, as though he had expected that answer. "Good." The Inquisitor turned to his troops. "Prepare extraction, stabilize the child, secure the Psyker, and ensure nothing from this chamber survives our departure." The Deathwatch moved instantly, fanning outward. Tech adepts spilled into the room, already setting charges. Servo skulls scanned the air for residual warp contamination. The chamber hummed, then shrieked as its ancient sigils began to crumble. Arik gathered Lyra into his arms as gently as his shaking muscles allowed. She stirred faintly, a small, fragile sound escaping her throat. For the first time since he was 12, Arik felt something like hope bleed past the terror. Not safety, not salvation, just a path, a cursed path, a dangerous path, but a path forward. As the inquisitorial forces guided him toward the expanding corridor of light, Arik looked back once more at the collapsing chamber, the broken remnants of memory, the warped echoes of the nightmare that had nearly consumed them both. The room buckled inward like a dying star, and then it was gone, an ending and the beginning of their new cursed existence. Together, whatever horrors awaited them next, they would face them side by side, even if the galaxy itself tried to tear them apart again.